Every industry has a creation myth, a story about the company that cracked the code, found the formula, built the thing that everyone else has been trying to build ever since. And for an entire generation of tabletop game publishers, that company was Games Workshop. Games Workshop charges prices that should not work. $50 for 10 plastic soldiers, $160 for a single character model, rulebooks that go out of date every few years by design, requiring you to buy the new one, an ecosystem so expensive to enter that hobbyists joke, well, only really half joking, that the actual game is managing your family's perception of your credit card statement. And yet, the stores are full. The community is massive. The revenue numbers are obscene. In the 52 weeks ending June of 2025, Games Workshop posted over £500 million in core revenue at a 38% operating margin. Not revenue, margin on plastic toys. So when Kickstarter turned crowdfunding into a viable publishing model around 2012, tabletop publishers did what any rational person would do when confronted with that kind of success. They tried to copy it. The lesson, they thought, was simple. Charge more, add more plastic, profit more. That lesson was wrong, and it led to many, many bankruptcies. To understand why so many publishers got this wrong, you have to understand the environment they were operating in. Kickstarter Tabletop in the early 2010s was a gold rush. The first Zombicide campaign in 2012 raised nearly $800,000 against the $20,000 goal. Exploding Kittens raised $8.7 million. Kingdom Death Monster, a miniature-heavy horror game with a $35,000 goal, raised $2 million in its first campaign and $12.4 million campaign in its second. The signal was deafening, right? Miniatures convert. Spectacle funds. The bigger the plastic, the bigger the check. And this tracked with everything publishers thought they knew about consumer behavior. People pay more for things that feel premium. Watches, cars, etc., etc. Miniatures feel premium. Ergo, miniatures justify premium pricing. It is the kind of logic that is wrong in a way that takes years and a macroeconomic shock to fully reveal itself, because for a while it works. The problem is that Kickstarter funding is not the same thing as unit economics. A campaign that raises 10 times its goal is not a business. It is a pre-order with no return policy and a delivery window measured in optimism. The money comes in before the costs are real. And miniatures are a product whose true costs only fully reveal themselves at the moment you can least afford to discover them, when the container is already loaded and the invoice is already due. Publishers looked at the funding numbers and saw validation. What they were actually seeing was demand measured before the supply chain priced itself. Let's talk about what vertical integration actually means and why it matters so much for this specific product category. Vertical integration is when a single company controls multiple stages of its own supply chain. Instead of paying a manufacturer to make your product, a distributor to move it, and a retailer to sell it, you simply own all three. Simply in, words. The profit that would have gone to each of those intermediaries stay inside the company. The markup that a third-party manufacturer charges you disappears because you are the manufacturer. The margin that a retailer takes off the top disappears because you own the store. For most industries, vertical integration is easier said than done. You are essentially building multiple businesses simultaneously and betting that the coordination costs of running them together are lower than the transaction cost of outsourcing each function. It is not always the right answer, but for a miniatures company specifically, it is the only answer that makes the economics survivable. Here's why. Miniatures have a cost structure that is fundamentally hostile to outsourcing. The tooling required to produce high-quality plastic miniatures is enormously expensive upfront. A single injection mold for a complex plastic kit can cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you are paying a third-party manufacturer to produce your miniatures, you are paying their margin on top of that tooling cost, on top of their labor, on top of their overhead. And because miniatures are a specialty product with exacting quality standards, the tolerances for fits, the detail on the scopes, the consistency of the plastic, you are also in constant negotiation with your manufacturer over quality control, which costs time and money and introduces variance into your product. Games Workshop resolved this problem by becoming their own manufacturer. Their plastic miniatures are produced in-house at Nottingham. Their design studio is co-located with their manufacturing facility. When a sculptor finishes a design, the tooling conversation happens internally. When quality issues arise, they are addressed internally. There is no vendor relationship to manage, no contract to renegotiate, no third-party margin to absorb. This is not just a cost advantage, it is a speed advantage and a quality advantage simultaneously. When demand for a particular kit spikes, when a new armor releases and a specific unit becomes essential for competitive play, Games Workshop can respond to that demand faster than any company relying on external manufacturing. When a new edition drops and old kits need to be updated, they control the timeline. No waiting on a factory in Shenzhen to open a production window. Now, expand this to retail. Games Workshop owns over 570 Warhammer stores across 23 countries, give or take a few. These are not just points of sale. They are controlled environments designed to convert curious people into committed hobbyists. The stores have gaming tables where you can play before you buy. They have staff who paint miniatures in the store window as a live demonstration. They run beginner workshops. They host community events. Every element of the store is engineered to collapse the distance between that looks interesting and I have now spent an absurd amount of money and I'm emotionally invested in this hobby. A third-party retailer cannot do this. A game store that carries 50 different product lines has no particular incentive to evangelize Warhammer over anything else on the shelf. They stock what sells and reorder what moves. Games Workshop stores exist for one purpose: to recruit people into the Warhammer hobby and keep them there. That is a fundamentally different retail function, and it only works because Games Workshop controls the space entirely. And then there is the consumables engine, which is the part of the business that most people completely overlook when they try to analyze why Games Workshop economies are so robust. Miniatures require paint, they require brushes, they require primer, basing materials, texture paint, technical paints, contrast paints, washes. Games Workshops sells all of this under the Citadel brand, and they are priced at a significant premium over generic alternatives. A pot of Citadel paint costs roughly $4 for 12 milliliters. A generic hobby paint costs roughly the same or less for significantly more volume. People buy Citadel paint anyway. Not because they are irrational, but because Citadel paint is color matched to Games Workshop's own painting guides, tutorial videos, and hobby ecosystem. If you are following an official Warhammer painting guide, it calls for specific Citadel colors by name. Substituting a generic equivalent requires research and experimentation. The path of least resistance is to buy the branded product. It is a deliberate design choice that converts every new hobbyist into a recurring Citadel consumer for as long as they remain in the hobby. This is the part that no Kickstarter publisher could replicate. The consumables revenue is not a bonus on top of the miniature revenue, it is a structural component of the business model that makes the miniature pricing sustainable. Games Workshop can price their miniatures at a level that feels premium to consumers, and is premium because they are not solely relying on miniature sales to generate margin. Every hobbyist they recruit generates an ongoing revenue stream in paint, brushes, miniatures, accessories, books that continues indefinitely. A Kickstarter publisher just sells you a box. Games Workshop recruits you into a hobby. It's a great source of recurring revenue. And the reason why the miniature myth was so destructive is that it was invisible from the outside. All anyone could see was the price tags. Nobody saw the tooling ownership, the retail network, the consumables engine, and the 40 years of compounding hobby investment, plus some great fiction that made those price tags sustainable. You cannot build that with a Kickstarter campaign. You cannot build that in 5 years. You might not be able to build it at all because the barriers to entry that Games Workshop has constructed are precisely the kind of structural advantages that get stronger the longer they exist and harder to replicate the longer you wait. Games Workshop is the moat. So when Kickstarter tabletop publishers looked at Games Workshop and thought they saw a blueprint, what they were actually looking at was the surface output of a 50-year institutional project, with none of the infrastructure underneath visible from the outside. CMON is the most instructive case study here because they came the closest to replicating the model, and their trajectory shows you exactly where the wheels come off. CMON, cool mini or not, started as a community website for posting painted miniature photos, a hobbyist rating site. Hot or not, pimp my ride, even, for Space Marines. They understood miniature culture from the inside, which gave them a genuine aesthetic advantage when they moved into publishing. Zombicide in 2012 was a legitimate cultural moment in Kickstarter tabletop. Blood Rage, Ankh. They built a catalog of games that the community genuinely loved. CMON raised over $108 total million through Kickstarter campaigns. They went public on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. They recorded revenues of more than $45 million in both 2022 and 2023 on the back of multi-million-dollar Kickstarter campaigns for miniature-heavy board games, including new Zombicide titles and games based on the Marvel and DC IP. On paper, the model was working. Getting Marvel and DC IP crossovers is real. Except the model was never actually working. What was happening was that each campaign was being funded by the enthusiasm of the next one. CMON warned in early 2025 that it could face losses of more than $2 million for 2024, a loss that would completely wipe out their $1.68 million in profits across their previous 3 years combined. 3 years of profits erased in 1 year. And that was before the tariffs fully hit. And then the tariffs hit. CMON had over $26.1 million in products awaiting delivery to backers. Games headed to the US were now subject to a 145% import tax based on the manufactured cost. A cost that was not on the radar of any crowdfunding project before October of last year. Campaigns that were fully funded but not yet delivered, like Masters of the Universe, the board game, could not change their prices. But their production costs may have just increased by as much as 150%. CMON would simply have to eat that cost to fulfill the campaign. In April of 2025, CMON announced layoffs and a pause on all future game development and new crowdfunding campaigns effective immediately. The largest miniature Kickstarter publisher in the world, frozen, because the cost structure they built was never designed to ignore macroeconomic shocks. It was designed to convert enthusiasm into cash, and it worked brilliantly right up until the moment it didn't. I want to make the cost structure explicit here because it is genuinely catastrophic. When a Kickstarter publisher builds their campaign budget, they are pricing for a product that does not exist yet for delivery 18 to 24 months in the future based on a manufacturing quote and a freight estimate that represents one scenario at one moment in time for one configuration of the product. Then they run the stretch goals. Every stretch goal is a negotiation between the publisher and the backer in which the publisher gets more money and the backer gets more plastic. And every piece of additional plastic costs money to tool, money to manufacture, money to package, money to ship, money to warehouse, and money to replace when it arrives broken. The stretch goal looks free to the backer because they already paid. It is not free to the publisher. It is a fixed cost addition to a product whose price is already locked. And miniatures are uniquely, structurally, the worst possible product for this dynamic. Consider the cost chain for a card game versus a miniature-heavy board game shipping from China to the United States. A card game is light. It is flat. It is packed efficiently. Thousands of copies fit in a single container. The freight cost per unit is low and relatively stable because cards are cards. There is not much variance in what a card weighs. A miniature-heavy board game is none of those things. It is heavy. It is three-dimensional, which means that it's volumetrically catastrophic. You are paying to ship the air inside the box in between the figures. The figures are fragile, which means you need protective packaging, which adds more weight, which costs more to ship, which also adds more space that you still have to pay for, which also means that some percentage will still arrive to damage, which means that you will need a replacement parts pipeline, which costs money indefinitely after the campaign ends. And this is before the macroeconomic environment enters the picture. We already established what happened to container prices. Before COVID, a 20-foot container ran around $5,000. Then $9,000. Then $21,000. Then some publishers were paying $35,000 to $40,000 for a single container. An 8-fold increase in freight cost applied to a product that you already sold at a fixed price is not a business problem. It is a meteor headed for the dinosaurs. The dangerous number in Kickstarter board game shipping is not the parcel quote alone. The real cost model combines, stay with me now, carton weight, dimensional weight, freight volatility, tariff exposure, pledge manager fee timing, warehouse receiving quality, and replacement risk. If those variables are not locked together before freight moves, a campaign can look fully funded and still be operationally underpriced. Miniatures maximize every bad variable in that list simultaneously. They are heavy, volumetrically inefficient, fragile, tariff exposed, and replacement cost intensive. There is no version of that product profile that is easily shipped profitably on a locked price from 2 years ago. The miniatures didn't just make the problem worse, they made the problem the problem. For any fan of Lovecraftian horror roguelikes, this one is for you. In 2022, Mythic Games ran a Kickstarter for the Darkest Dungeon board game. Their funding goal was $300,000. They raised $5.7 million, 19 times their target. By every conventional metric, an enormous success. They then collapsed anyway. By the time fulfillment was underway, shipping and manufacturing costs had ballooned far beyond what the campaign had priced in. Mythic had already absorbed over $1 million in unexpected costs out of pocket. And then they sent backers an update that is now infamous in the tabletop community, essentially telling them that if they wanted to receive the game that they had already paid for, they might need to pay more. You raised $5.7 million. You are now ransoming the product back to the people who funded it. A criminal investigation was opened. It was later closed. There was no fraud or misappropriation or bad actors. Just catastrophically bad unit economics, meeting a macroeconomic shock that the business model was structurally unable to survive. Red Hook Studios, who owned the Darkest Dungeon IP, eventually announced that Mythic can no longer manufacture or deliver the game. Backers received the game files, print, and play. $5.7 million bought print and play. The most funded campaign became the biggest failure. Not because anyone was dishonest, but because the math was never real. The miniatures looked like value. The shipping container didn't care what they looked like. The miniature myth did not just hurt the publishers who believed it, it restructured the entire competitive landscape of tabletop crowdfunding in ways that damaged the industry broadly. It priced out casual players. A midweight board game that should retail for $50 or $60 became a $100 Kickstarter exclusive because somebody decided that it needed miniatures that added nothing to the gameplay. Tapestry, to use the canonical example, shipped with large three-dimensional plastic figures whose entire mechanical function was to cover spaces on a board. Cardboard Cities, or Cardboard Chits, would have done the same job for a fraction of the cost and weight. It trained publishers to compete on spectacle rather than design. The campaigns that funded biggest were the ones with the most dramatic renders. The games that played best frequently had nothing to do with that. You ended up with a selection effect where the crowdfunding ecosystem systematically rewarded visual marketing over game design, which is a terrible filter if you are trying to build a sustainable publishing business. And it burned credibility, collective credibility. Every Mythic scale collapse makes the next legitimate campaign harder to fund. Backers who got print and play files after waiting 3 years for a $500 pledge are not rushing back to the miniature-heavy Kickstarter that popped up next. The externality of these failures lands on the entire crowdfunding ecosystem, not just the publisher that failed.